common view that the United States and China are headed for a new Cold War. And in this view, China is a revisionist, bent on becoming the world's preeminent power, displacing the United States and undermining the so-called rules-based international order. Not too long ago, policymakers were calling China a stakeholder, one that could be peacefully integrated, even socialized into the open and rules-based system. And another perspective kind of related to this is not that China was a spoiler, but in fact a free rider, one that wasn't contributing enough to sustaining that system and providing public goods. But over time, I think we've seen more variation than any of these simple slogans or bumper stickers can capture. So explaining this variation, I think, is a really important task, one that will help us gain insight into how and on what issues might China seek to reshape the international order, and in what direction, and in what areas might it seek to perpetuate or maintain existing elements of that system. In an important academic article, Ian Johnston, writing in International Security, began to disaggregate the rules-based international order into many different orders, and he laid out, I think it was 7. But importantly, he looked at the variation between the areas of the international order that China supported and the United States supported, but also the areas where the United States opposed and China opposed. And you can see here the kind of 2-by-2 division where you have, in some cases, for example, the UN Security Council, the WTO, the G20, the IMF, the World Bank. You have both the United States and China supporting, at least nominally, supporting these institutions. But in other cases, you have both of these powers being pretty disgruntled with the international system. For example, opposing the International Criminal Court. Neither has ratified the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. These kinds of things, and both have had, to varying degrees of kind of reluctance about reforming the UN Security Council. I would say that over time, we have seen, even since I began this project a few years ago, an increasing drift, at least in terms of the emphasis that the United States and China have put from areas where both have supported to areas where either both oppose, or increasingly, when the United States supports something, China opposes it. When China supports something, the United States opposes it, or certainly at least sits it out. And so explaining this variation, where it came from and where it's going, I think is really important to understand whether or not there is a possibility for peaceful, if competitive, coexistence in the existing multilateral system, or whether the center cannot really hold in the context of US-China rivalry. Now, at the rhetorical level, China has increasingly styled itself as a champion of quote-unquote true multilateralism, criticizing the United States and other developed democracies for leading a biased and outdated system that favors a small minority of wealthy countries. And over the past few years, Xi Jinping, now having secured a 3rd term in China, he has encouraged and continues to encourage Chinese diplomats to take an active role in, quote, leading the reform of global governance, including reshaping global norms to emphasize state sovereignty over individual rights and universal values. But beneath this soaring rhetoric, there is a lot more variation beneath the surface. Where and how will China seek to lead? On what issues will it be dogmatic, and on what issues will it be more flexible and willing to go along with a multilateral consensus? Disaggregating Chinese preferences is an important step to figuring this out. And the purpose of my project and my talk today here is to talk about how the domestic politics beneath authoritarian rule in China can illuminate this variation. So my starting premise is that the Chinese Communist Party, currently led by Xi Jinping, is first and foremost concerned with staying in power, like most governments. And as the Communist Party in China is one of the few remaining communist parties that rules in the world, it is deathly afraid of going the way of the others, and particularly the Soviet Union. And so I've written that what the Chinese Communist Party seeks is a world safe for the CCP, first and foremost, but also for autocracy. And survival here is more than just about repression, which is of course an important part of the toolkit, but it's also about persuasion and co-optation. Bread, but also circuses to bolster popular support. And I've argued that there are two dimensions that we can understand Chinese politics as following, but not just Chinese politics. You could think about this in any country: centrality and contestation. What do I mean by centrality? Really, since the 1970s, after Mao Zedong's death, the Chinese Communist Party has looked to three central pillars to legitimate its continued rule: nationalism, growth, and social stability. Sometimes in Chinese, this is called 主权、安全和发展. And so on issues that are tightly linked to these central pillars, like homeland issues such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, and maritime and island disputes, the Chinese government has been very firm in resisting international pressure, and even when these have led to international criticism, such as when China rejected the ruling of the International Tribunal that invalidated China's claims in the South China Sea. But on many other issues that are less centrally tied to domestic legitimacy in China, like international peacekeeping, non-proliferation, many issues before the United Nations, the Chinese government has been a lot more flexible, even pragmatic, in going along with, or at least in some ways deferring to, the international consensus. And so the predictions here, as a political scientist here, I say that the more central an issue is, the harder it is for the Chinese government to concede on an issue without suffering some kind of domestic backlash at home. And so as a result, international pressure on these central issues is more likely to backfire by producing pressure on the government domestically to be seen as tough in defending its national interests. And the more likely such a government is to go it alone in pursuit of its interests. This then in turn, following the logic of the two-level game, this kind of domestic pressure or constraint can, on the one hand, potentially offer potential bargaining leverage, but it can also make it harder to reach any kind of negotiated solution, given its difficulty compromising. And ultimately, whether or not these domestic pressures or constraints lead to conflict or a settlement really depends upon the positions and the interests and the resolve of outside stakeholders, whether or not they too stand firm or are in some way willing to negotiate on that issue. But I think it's also important to note that these central pillars, nationalism, growth, and stability, are not always working seamlessly together. There are mutual contradictions, if you will. So for example, political scientist Taylor Fravel has shown that when managing China's territorial disputes, China has been historically willing to compromise even on an issue as central as national territory, when it had an interest in shoring up domestic stability, seeking the help of the neighboring country in shoring up security and control over those minority populations in frontier regions. The second dimension, putting aside centrality for a moment, is contestation, because underneath the veneer of CCP rule lies a great deal of contestation and internal division. It may be hard to see sometimes, especially as Xi Jinping has centralized power. But nonetheless, there is a great deal of geographic, economic, institutional, ideological variation inside China. Here I've put up a graph of where it was that nationalist protests took place in 2012 against Japan. You can see that it's not consistent across the country, it's sort of a smattering. And in the ideological realm, for example, a prominent Chinese scholar, Yan Xuetong, has argued that while Marxism is the official ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, it has had actually limited influence on Chinese actual foreign policy. At least, perhaps he might want to update his views now. Nonetheless, through the most of the post-Mao period, I would say that this is, I would agree with this assessment. And we can't really understand China's response to COVID-19, at least its initial outbreak, without reference to these center-local divisions in China, where local party officials in Wuhan tried to cover up the extent of human-to-human transmission when national, central-level officials came to investigate. It was on the eve of important party meetings, and those local officials didn't want anything to seem amiss. And by the time national-level officials grasped the scale of the emergency, it was too late, both for China, but then also for the world. And so what does this mean then, this domestic variation inside China? More variation, more contestation means that oftentimes we're going to see difficulty with implementation and enforcement of whatever international commitments that China makes. So take, again, the example of China's international environmental commitments. Local officials have often resisted central directives to shut down polluting firms, as it still remains that economic development is of primary importance in Chinese local officials' promotion prospects. And the more this kind of heterogeneity and contestation, the more that we are likely to see some policies benefit some at the expense of other interests inside the Chinese system who might then have to be bought off or compensated with side payments. And oftentimes state leaders will set out a general direction or a big slogan, but oftentimes leave a lot of the details to local levels. And as a result, concentrated domestic interests can end up dominating the design and implementation of various policies. So for example, recent research on the Belt and Road Initiative indicated that it was largely an encompassing but pretty vague slogan that, according to Yuanyuan Ang, makes it easy for domestic interest groups to use national policy as a cover to pursue their own agenda. So putting this together then, centrality and contestation don't necessarily map neatly onto one another. Some highly central issues are not particularly contested, but other issues like internet governance, climate change, trade, exchange rates, all have a lot of winners and losers depending on what policy is. And then you have a bunch of, on the lower half of the table, a number of issues that are much less central. But even then, you still have sometimes these kind of individual or concentrated domestic actors playing a key role in shaping outcomes. So for example, Ian Johnston notes that during the Iran nuclear deal, China played a key role in helping redesign a key reactor, but also didn't, because of the very well-connected interests of a particular arms exporter in China, didn't manage to halt the export of ballistic missile technology to Iran. So again, you have these problems of partial compliance. So far, at least, I've given you kind of a, from the inside out, that's what we could call a second image approach, where domestic interests, ideas, and debates shape foreign policy behavior. But I think it's really important to understand also how the international environment in turn influences domestic incentives and debates. And so to take a concrete example here, the Chinese Communist Party has, I think, in recent years, tried to increase the centrality and decrease the heterogeneity of a number of different international issues, such as framing the protests in Hong Kong or the US-China trade war as a national struggle, reminiscent of the Opium War or the Korean War and other long-running disputes where Chinese leaders eventually sought to prevail. And in doing so, by using their propaganda powers to frame issues in this way, they have tried to build popular support for the costs, inevitably, that would accompany the costs of these kinds of conflicts, make it harder to offer international concessions, and signal just how resolved the Chinese government is to stand up to foreign pressure. And as I showed in my first book, Powerful Patriots, the government in China has often tolerated and sometimes even encouraged nationalist mobilization to convey resolve. In fact, I show that the government has been actually quite strategic in deciding when to allow and when to repress nationalist protests. And more recently, this kind of mobilization has taken place more online than offline in the streets, where the government has tolerated, in some cases encouraged, efforts on social media and other online platforms, really to drown out or even persecute, in some cases, those that would criticize government policy or performance. But it's important to note that the government doesn't always choose to mobilize hawkish voices. At least in the past, my work shows that the government has devoted nearly equal effort to repressing and tamping down nationalist voices in order to preserve flexibility, manage risks of escalation, and signal reassurance. But you might ask, well, does any of this matter really in the context of an increasingly authoritarian, under the increasingly authoritarian rule of Xi Jinping, if The government in China can use its propaganda powers to control the narrative, and various domestic actors compete to cheerlead and toe the party line. How is any of this domestic ferment, if you will, affecting Chinese foreign policy? So to ask and investigate this question, I and some co-authors have turned to survey experiments, which in a nutshell have shown that the Chinese government can in fact buy some wiggle room by using tough talk or bluster to appease some of these nationalist voices, but it still pays some cost in terms of public support if it doesn't take tough action. And so we did this using both kind of real-time as well as hypothetical scenarios. And so while we found that the Chinese government does in fact face what political scientists call audience costs for making threats but then not fulfilling them, more common is what we call bluster, which is this sort of tough but vague talk. For example, China declared an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea after a crisis with Japan over the disputed islands there. And so Beijing employed these kind of fiery words, demanded that foreign aircraft comply, but then didn't actually do anything to enforce that new zone. And so when we reminded Chinese survey respondents who took this online of the declaration of the air defense identification zone, they were more likely to approve of the government's performance, even though they knew that the government had not taken action to back it up. However, when we looked at Chinese public responses to a variety of perceived provocations, both real and exaggerated, hypothetical and remembered, we found a decrease in domestic approval of the Chinese government's performance, again, controlling for the outcome of that scenario. So this has important implications because there's a conventional story that says that authoritarian leaders like China's can invoke public foreign humiliations just to rally public opinion around the flag. But my research suggests that those rally effects are conditional on what the government says and does. And that means that the government may have a harder time invoking things like the death of the Chinese pilot Wang Wei, who died in that AP-3 collision in 2001, without also stoking pressure for tough action. And we saw this when we looked at the resumption of US freedom of navigation patrols in 2015. Surveying respondents before, during, and after these patrols resumed, we saw an uptick in popular disapproval of the Chinese government, even though it used plenty of bluster, believe me, to warn against and denounce these patrols. But ultimately, on the water, the Chinese government didn't do anything. And so these results suggest that despite the Chinese government's use of tough rhetoric and bluster, it is unable to fully offset the costs of restraint in the face of foreign military actions. And so while it's true the Chinese government does have some wiggle room, these kinds of efforts by the United States and others to strengthen deterrence through public presence operations in waters near Chinese claimed territories may actually have an unwanted effect of stoking popular pressure inside China for tough action. And I would say that following the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the Chinese government's reaction, including encircling Taiwan with missile tests and military exercises, were nonetheless deemed by many Chinese netizens, at least according to a Chinese official who told me this, they were seen as not sufficiently tough in responding to Pelosi's visit. Now, we obviously have to take any such comments with a grain of salt, but at least it suggests that to this day, Chinese officials are still referring to this pressure in invoking just how difficult these issues are for them to manage. I now want to zoom out a bit and put this all together. How is it that these inside-out, outside-in dynamics are likely to contribute to the overall trajectory of Chinese foreign policy and to US-China relations? In the short run, I expect the Chinese government to continue to try to thread the needle between projecting resolve, as Xi Jinping has said, dare to struggle and be good at fighting, while also seeking to mitigate the near-term risks of unwanted escalation and to avoid a war that could be avoided. At the same time, I think over the long run, the picture is a little bit more bleak because the growing repression of more liberal or dovish voices inside China has really heightened foreign perceptions of the threat that China poses to the world. And even though we do see hawkish voices in China temporarily muffled, it's usually more like a slap on the wrist. It's not the same kind of systemic repression that we see on the more liberal or dovish side of the spectrum. And this lean toward resolve and away from assurance really reduces the credibility of Chinese claims to be, simply rising peacefully, not seeking conflict. In my view, the United States and China are presently engaged in an action-reaction escalatory spiral, one that has created incentives on both sides of the Pacific to narrow the bounds of domestic debate, strengthening hawkish tendencies on both sides and the instinct to reflexively counter and outcompete the other. As far as policymakers trying to shape China and shape Chinese behavior, the framework yields some implications. First, for issues that fall into this high centrality, low contestation, upper left-hand quadrant, I think it's important to acknowledge that there may be counterproductive effects of international pressure on these issues. There's some very good work by Professor Jamie Griffith-Jones looking at the counterproductive or backlash effect of US and Western pressure on Chinese human rights, actually reducing domestic concerns inside China for those issues, such as women's rights. Historically, there have been a lot of issues that fell into this high centrality but high contestation area where international policymakers have often tried to play one powerful domestic constituency off another in order to get the Chinese government to move. So for example, on Chinese currency exchange rates, this worked. Multilateral pressure helped accelerate renminbi appreciation, but the Chinese government then had to compensate the domestic losers of that policy using subsidies and other kinds of preferential policies to buy off their opposition. But whether that kind of a strategy is feasible depends on a couple of things. First, you have to have visible, divergent constituencies inside China with whom one could work, and I think that in the current context, this is quite unlikely. And oftentimes, those constituencies may or may not be powerful enough, even if you were to try to work with them, to shift the balance in policy. And so, for example, on the issue of internet governance, the scholar Molly Roberts has shown, censorship acts like a regressive tax. So, the wealthy basically can jump the Great Firewall while the poor can't, or aren't even aware that the Great Firewall exists inside China. And so when you have like the powerful not suffering, then there's really little space for external actors to do anything to mobilize those who are suffering from that policy to demand change. In general, it's on the low centrality issues that international and multilateral pressure especially, I think, is likely to be most successful. But there may still be some enforcement issues if you have powerful actors capturing policy. So to wrap up, if China is simultaneously a revisionist, a reformer, a free rider, and a defender of different aspects of the international order, if you had to sum up what China is, perhaps disgruntled stakeholder would be preferable. An important takeaway from this research suggests that what the Chinese Communist Party has sought first and foremost is regime survival and legitimacy that's been premised on these three pillars: nationalism, growth, and stability. And over time, the mix and the balance or the weighting of those pillars has shifted, but nonetheless, we can understand China's international behavior as the spillover of these domestic investments. And sometimes these spillover effects are positive, like China's investments in renewable energy technologies, making it cheaper to install solar around the world. At other times, that spillover is quite negative from the perspective of liberal values. China's investments in surveillance technology and its export overseas to whoever wants to buy it is a good example of a negative externality of China's investments domestically. And ultimately, treating the contestation of ideas, interests, and sort of localities inside China means treating China's intentions ultimately as a moving target, rather than, as you often hear, something that you can deduce simply by reading a speech that Xi Jinping gave in 2013. And so while Xi Jinping may be setting out a direction like national rejuvenation, the details really remain to be seen. What will that look like? What will those requirements be? And what happens when that vision meets reality? This is going to be an evolving process, not a blueprint that is hidden away in some drawer. So what does this mean then for the future of the international order? As I said, the Chinese Communist Party's preferences and behavior are only one input into what you might call the strategic renegotiation of the international order. The United States and other powers also have a great deal of agency, as well as the rest of the world. And so far at least, on both sides of the Pacific, we see increased efforts, I think, to reject the other side's influence in the international system, as well as to build smaller, kind of fit-for-purpose coalitions outside the encompassing institutions that have, I think, underpinned the world order since World War II. And I would say much of the US cynicism about the WTO or WHO, other international institutions, is that the sense that they have benefited China at the expense of US interests. And that's undermined public confidence in them, and which has in turn put the whole system, I think, in jeopardy. And so I think there's a really big question for the United States and other liberal democracies, which is how to balance tolerating enough influence for China in the international system in order to remain inside and invested in it, without also undermining the United States and other liberal democracies' interests in defending and supporting it. So where should the United States and others seek to reinvest, and where can we learn to live with, to some extent, PRC influence? This means that we're probably going to see a lot of heated contestation, even confrontation, on central issues, ranging from human rights to internet governance. And on these issues, where both sides are really at loggerheads, I suspect we will continue to see them holding up the functioning of encompassing international institutions and continuing to pursue unilateral action, as well as smaller groupings outside of those encompassing settings. So absent some kind of grand bargain or a concert of powers, I think the best case scenario for avoiding the kind of paralysis or stagnation of the multilateral system is really to have, I would say, an encompassing but nested set of orders where you have sort of the least common denominator at the United Nations reflecting the kind of sovereignty Westphalian-based model of equality amongst sovereign states, while other smaller groupings take up other issues to press forward with their respective values. And I think we really do see this tension between the kind of centrifugal and centripetal forces, where too much pulling apart could end up meaning that the center of the rules-based order no longer holds. Ultimately, China's domestic social purpose doesn't require the wholesale destruction of the international order, but it is trying to reshape it in ways that favor a more conservative version of Westphalian norms of sovereignty and non-interference, emphasizing the primacy of the state and development over individual political rights. But as I noted at the outset, there are a lot of ways in which China's behavior is at odds with or in tension with this principled defense of sovereignty. And so if China wants to see a return to a Westphalian system, it will need to curtail some of these extrusions of sharp power, one might call it, into other societies. And I'm increasingly concerned that while we may not love the idea of a more Westphalian order, it might be better than the alternative. Now, some have looked to China's growing influence and more assertive efforts to secure what it calls its core interests, and concluded that China is an existential threat to the United States and liberal democracy around the world. I think that's unfortunate because I think it's an exaggeration. So far, at least, the Chinese Communist Party has sought a world that's safe for autocracy, but that doesn't have to be incompatible with a world safe for democracy, too. Again, a Westphalian system, in principle, if it were working, would protect the ability of different systems and their respective ways of life. So far, at least, China's kind of ambitions have been more nationalistic than they have been universalistic, although its efforts to punish and intimidate critics of the CCP have increasingly gone global, and in recent years, Xi Jinping has begun to talk about the lessons that other countries might draw from China's successful example, an alternative to the Washington consensus. You don't need democracy in order to develop, China wants to say. But so far, at least, the Chinese government's official position is that each country should have the right to pursue its own path. And that is a kind of a particularistic vision rather than a universalistic effort to remake other countries in China's image. Ultimately, in my view, although I acknowledge that there is a real risk that this kind of autocracy versus democracy dimension of the competition escalates and provokes or encourages China to make common cause with Russia, copy its efforts to undermine and subvert democracies. That is a world we should try to avert. And I don't think it's inevitable, but we are certainly moving in that direction. And so I've also written about why we should not seek to escalate this ideological competition, but instead focus on some of the principles I've outlined here, as well as trying to improve governance wherever it can be improved, rather than drawing lines between camps of different types of countries. And ultimately, I think the best response to an increasingly nationalistic and assertive China is to really be the best version of ourselves, to invest in our strengths and lead with the affirmative of the future that we want, rather than the future that we fear. In the end, really, I think there's a question as to whether or not democracies ought to spend more time running faster or slowing down the competition. And in my view, running faster is certainly, the balance of effort certainly ought to fall to the running faster. And I worry about efforts that are intended to slow China down also undermining our own ability to be the best version of ourselves. So with that, I will end, and looking forward to your comments and questions.